They called it the cruelest thing Robert Anderson had ever done. Catherine Anderson stood in that cramped law office with her two children pressed against her sides, watching her older brother laugh at the rusted key sitting on the mahogany table. The sound started controlled a short exhalation, then broke free into something uglier. Beside him, Stephanie covered her mouth with one manicured hand, but her shoulders shook anyway. The office of Harrison and Briggs occupied the second floor of a narrow brick building on Clarksville's Main Street. It smelled like old paper and furniture polish, with framed certificates lining the walls, and a receptionist who spoke in careful whispers, as though the entire building existed in a permanent state of mourning. Catherine sat in a chair that felt too stiff for someone wearing a second-hand sweater and boots held together with electrical tape. Her dark auburn hair was pulled back with a rubber band she'd found at the bottom of her bag that morning. Rachel, 9 years old, sat to her left, quietly drawing shapes on a notepad the receptionist had provided. To her right, Brian, 6 years old, leaned against Catherine's arm with the kind of boneless exhaustion that comes from moving too much and sleeping too little. Robert Anderson had died 5 weeks earlier. 71 years old, a stroke in the early morning gone before the ambulance reached his small rental house on the outskirts of Nashville. He'd been a quiet man, complicated in ways Catherine had spent years trying to understand. A former tobacco farmer who'd bounced between small properties in rural Tennessee for the last 2 decades, buying things cheap, selling them cheaper, never quite building the life he seemed always to be reaching toward. Catherine had been the one driving 4 hours every few months to check on him, who'd organized his medications after his first minor stroke 3 years ago, who'd sat beside him through 2 hospitalizations and helped him make sense of the paperwork doctors handed over like it should be self-explanatory. She hadn't done it expecting anything in return. She'd done it because he was her father and because nobody else was doing it. Christopher and Stephanie had their own lives. Christopher, 43, ran a moderately successful landscaping company in Nashville and possessed a particular talent for making his absence sound like a personal sacrifice. Stephanie, 41, had married into comfortable money in Chattanooga and communicated mainly through brief text messages and birthday cards that arrived 3 days late. Neither had visited Robert in the final 2 years of his life. Catherine knew this not because anyone had told her, but because every time she arrived at her father's house, the guest room was exactly as she'd left it from her previous visit. Same folded towel on the bed, same half-empty water bottle on the nightstand. Attorney Edward Harrison was a compact man in his late 60s, with silver reading glasses and the careful, measured energy of someone who'd delivered difficult news many times and learned that the best approach was steady and without apology. He read the will in the order it was written, his voice flat and professional. Christopher received the savings account, which held $47,000. He also received the 2019 Ford pickup truck and a collection of antique farm tools Robert had stored in a rented unit across town. Stephanie received the investment portfolio, modest but real valued at approximately $62,000. She also received the personal property furniture books, watches, the few pieces of jewelry their mother had left behind. Christopher exhaled with quiet satisfaction. Stephanie allowed herself a small smile and wrote something in the leather notebook she'd brought, already calculating. Neither looked at Catherine. Edward Harrison paused before continuing. He removed his glasses, cleaned them once with the cloth from his breast pocket, replaced them. Then he looked at Catherine with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life. Not pity, exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that knew what was coming and couldn't prevent it. To my daughter, Catherine, I leave the property located at 47 Willow Creek Road, Harlan County, Tennessee. The farmhouse, all structures on the land, all contents therein, and the 3.4 acres on which it stands. Christopher laughed first. It started as a short sound, almost a cough, like he was trying not to, and then it wasn't controlled at all. Stephanie put her hand over her mouth, but her shoulders were shaking. Catherine sat very still. "What's the Willow Creek property?" Christopher wiped his eye. "Dad bought it at a tax auction about 8 years ago. Paid $9 for it. Literally $9 because nobody else wanted it. He always talked about fixing it up someday. He never did. The county's been after him for years to either renovate or demolish it. It's condemned." Stephanie composed herself, straightened in her chair. "There was a fire years ago. Partial damage to one side. The roof has sections that have caved in. I think there might even be a structural violation notice on the property." She looked at Catherine with something dressed up as sympathy. "It's basically a liability." Edward Harrison produced a manila envelope and slid it across the table. Inside were documents and a key, old, iron dark, with age heavier than it looked. "There is one condition. The property cannot be sold for a period of 18 months from the date of Robert Anderson's passing. After that period, you're free to sell or dispose of it as you see fit." 18 months! Christopher muttered it like a curse. "You'll be paying property taxes on a condemned building you can't unload." Stephanie leaned forward with an offer already rehearsed. "When the 18 months are up, we'll take it off your hands. We can probably do 10, maybe 15,000, enough to cover whatever you've spent on it by then. 15,000 for a condemned farmhouse on 3.4 acres of Harlan County land that her father had paid $9 for." The contempt was breathtaking. Catherine picked up the key. She held it in her palm. It was cold and solid, and fit her hand in a way that felt strangely deliberate. Why would he do this? She asked it not to Christopher or Stephanie, but to Edward Harrison, the only person in the room she felt she could trust with the question. Harrison looked at her carefully. "He told me that each of his children was receiving exactly what they deserved and exactly what they needed. He said you, in particular, would understand what to do with it, even if you didn't know that yet. You were always the responsible one." Christopher stood, buttoning his jacket. The one who showed up. He patted her shoulder once in a way that managed to feel like a dismissal. But responsible doesn't always mean rewarded. He and Stephanie left together, already talking about next steps, estate logistics, the truck, the investment account. Harrison gathered his papers. He handed Catherine a second document, a property survey, a county inspection notice, and 2 photographs. The first showed a 2-story farmhouse set back from a gravel road, white paint peeling in long strips, a porch leaning away from the front of the house at a troubling angle, one upstairs window boarded with plywood, a handwritten "No Trespassing" sign stapled to a post at the edge of an overgrown yard. The second photograph was older. The colors faded in that particular way of prints from the 1970s. A young man, maybe 25, stood in front of the same farmhouse. The house in this picture was maintained, the porch straight, the paint fresh. The man was smiling, one hand raised in a wave. Catherine turned the photograph over. Faded pencil writing on the back read, "Robert Anderson, age 24, summer 1977. Willow Creek Family Home, Family Home. Catherine sat alone at the mahogany table with an envelope, a key, 2 photographs, and 2 children who had quietly fallen asleep in their chairs without anyone noticing. She looked at both photographs for a long time. She had nowhere to go. She and the children had been living out of her 2009 Honda Civic for 6 weeks since the Memphis apartment she'd rented with her caregiving salary had become unaffordable the week after her last client passed away. She had $214 in her bank account, 2 children, a car with a slow leak in the rear left tire, and now a condemned farmhouse in a county she'd never been to. Her brother thought it was a joke. Her sister thought it was an insult. But Catherine Anderson looked at those photographs and saw something neither of them had looked closely enough to notice. Through all the damage and decay, through the peeling paint and the leaning porch and the boarded windows, the structure of that house was still standing. Whatever had been done to it, whatever years of neglect and fire and Tennessee winters had thrown at it, the walls were still there. And sometimes Catherine thought, closing her fingers around the key, the walls are everything. She woke Rachel and Brian, gently put her arms around them both, in the parking lot outside Harrison, and Briggs held them for a moment in the cold morning air. Then she buckled them into the back seat, typed 47 Willow Creek Road into her phone, and started the car. Before we go further, let me ask something. Have you ever been the one in your family who shows up when no one else does, the one who makes the sacrifices while others make excuses? Hold that thought. Remember what it feels like to be dismissed for doing the right thing, because what happened next would prove that sometimes the people who laugh at you simply don't know how to see what you see. The drive to Harlan County took just under 2 hours. Catherine drove with the kind of focused quiet that had become her default state over the past 6 weeks. The radio stayed off. Her eyes stayed on the road. Her mind ran through numbers and possibilities the way it always did when she had no good options and needed to find one anyway. Rachel sat in the back, reading a library book she'd checked out 3 towns ago and never returned. Brian had fallen back asleep, with his cheek pressed against the window and his mouth slightly open. Outside, Nashville's edges gave way to smaller towns, then smaller still, and eventually to the long, flat stretches of rural Tennessee, where the landscape opened into fields and tree lines and the occasional farmhouse set so far back from the road it looked like it was trying not to be seen. Catherine had grown up in a small town not far from here. She knew this kind of country. She knew the way silence sat differently in places like this, heavier and more honest than city silence. She knew the smell of red clay after rain and the particular quality of light on an open field in early spring. There was something about driving into this landscape that felt less like arriving somewhere new and more like returning somewhere she'd left without meaning to. The GPS directed her off the main highway onto a county road, then off that onto a gravel road that ran between 2 overgrown fields. A rusted mailbox leaned at the edge of the property, the numbers 4 and 7 barely visible beneath a skin of brown corrosion. Catherine turned in slowly. The gravel crunched under the tires. She drove perhaps 100 yards before the farmhouse came into full view, and she stopped the car completely. The photograph Edward Harrison had given her had not done it justice. In the photograph, distance had softened things. In person, there was no softening. The farmhouse was 2 stories of weathered white siding sitting on a low stone foundation, and it looked like it had been slowly losing an argument with time for the better part of 30 years. The front porch had separated from the main structure on the left side and tilted toward the ground at an angle that suggested the next significant wind might finish the job. Every window on the ground floor was either boarded with plywood or broken entirely, the glass long gone, the frames dark with moisture damage. The fire that Stephanie had mentioned had taken most of the right side of the second floor. The exterior wall up there was blackened and bowed outward, and a section of roof above it had collapsed inward, leaving a ragged open wound in the roofline that exposed dark rafters to the sky. Weeds had taken the yard completely. A collapsed fence ran along the left side of the property, its posts rotted at the base and lying in the grass like something that had simply given up. Behind the house, Catherine could see the outline of a barn, or what had been a barn, now mostly a skeleton of gray timber. An old county notice, stapled to a wooden stake near the drive, read, "Condemnation Order" in bold black letters. Faded, but legible, the county seal still visible. Brian had woken up during the slow drive in. He pressed his face against the window and stared. "Is that our house?" Catherine looked at it for a long moment before answering. "It's going to be." Rachel looked up from her book. "It looks broken." "It is, but broken things can be fixed." She said it with more certainty than she felt, because that was what you did when your children were watching you decide whether to be afraid. She got out of the car and walked toward the house slowly. The yard was wet from recent rain, and the weeds soaked her boots to the ankle within the first few steps. She walked the perimeter, first the way she'd learned to do when assessing her father's properties during his illness, going all the way around before going in, looking at the foundation, the roofline, the exterior walls. The stone foundation was old but solid, the mortar crumbling in places, but the stones themselves massive and unmoved. The walls on the left side and the front of the house away from the fire damage were structurally intact. The wood was soft in places, but the framing beneath was holding. The porch was cosmetic damage, serious looking, but not structural. The right side and part of the rear were a different story. The fire had done real work there, and the subsequent years of exposure had done more. But the bones were there. Catherine stood at the back of the property and looked at the house from a distance and made herself see it, not as it was, but as it could be. Large windows, good proportions, a generous footprint. 3.4 acres of land with a creek she could hear but not yet see running along the back edge of the property. A barn that was damaged but not gone. She walked back to the car and got the key from the envelope. The front door was padlocked with a chain that had rusted nearly through. She didn't even need the bolt cutters she'd stopped to buy on the way. She applied steady pressure, and the chain gave with a dry snap. She used the old iron key in the door lock. It resisted grinding with rust, and then turned with a deep mechanical click that echoed off the porch boards. Catherine pushed the door open. The smell came first, damp wood ash, old earth, and something underneath it all that she couldn't name yet. Something dry and faintly sweet, like old paper or cedar. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust to the dimness inside. Rachel and Brian appeared at her sides, one under each arm, looking in with her. The three of them stood there together at the threshold of a condemned farmhouse in Harlan County, Tennessee, with $200 in the bank and nowhere else to go. Catherine took a breath. Then she stepped inside. The inside of the farmhouse was darker than the outside had prepared her for. Catherine moved through the entrance, slowly phone light cutting through the dimness, Rachel and Brian staying close behind her. The entry hall was narrow, maybe 4 feet wide, with a low ceiling and walls covered in peeling wallpaper, a faded floral pattern in yellow and green that had bubbled and separated from the plaster in long, curling strips. The floor was wide plank wood buried under a layer of debris. Plaster dust leaves blown in through broken windows and the scattered remains of what had once been furniture. A wooden chair with 3 legs, a broken picture frame glass, long gone, its backing swollen with moisture. Catherine tested each step carefully before committing her weight. The boards flexed but held. She moved into what had been the main living room and stopped. Even through the damage, the room was larger than she'd expected. Ceilings ran higher than typical farmhouse construction, maybe 10 feet, which was unusual for a rural Tennessee property of this age. The fireplace on the far wall was brick floor-to-ceiling wide enough to stand in, its mantel still intact, though coated in thick gray dust. 2 windows flanked it, both boarded from the outside, but large, their frames showing the width and height that would flood this room with light if the boards ever came down. She moved through to the kitchen, smaller practical with a cast-iron wood-burning stove still standing against the back wall, heavy and dark and entirely solid. The counters were rotted through in places, and the sink had pulled away from the wall, but the room's layout was sensible, and the exterior wall showed no structural compromise. A back door led out to what had been a small covered porch, and beyond that the yard and the barn. The door hung crooked in its frame, but opened when Catherine lifted it slightly and pushed. The right side of the house she approached carefully. The fire damage was concentrated here, in what had been a sitting room or study, and the ceiling above it had partially collapsed, bringing down sections of the second floor with it. Catherine did not go far into this room. She stood at its entrance, assessed, and stepped back. This was not where she would start. This was a problem for later, for when she had more knowledge and more resources and more of a plan. The staircase to the second floor was along the left interior wall, away from the fire damage, and it surprised her. The treads were wide and solid, cut from thick timber that had barely shifted in however many decades this house had been standing. Catherine went up slowly, hand on the wall, testing. The second floor was divided into 3 rooms. The 2 toward the right side of the house showed smoke damage and, in one case, a section of collapsed roof that let in a column of gray afternoon light. But the left side bedroom was untouched by the fire. Small square with a single window looking out over the fields. Its floor dusty but level, its walls intact. This would be their room, at least for now. That evening, Catherine made up 2 sleeping areas on the floor using blankets from the car. She found a section of the kitchen floor that was solid and swept it clean with a branch she pulled from the yard, and they ate crackers and peanut butter by the light of her phone. Brian fell asleep quickly, the way he always did, completely and without argument. Rachel lay on her back, looking at the ceiling for a long time before she spoke. "Mom, are we going to be okay?" Catherine lay beside her in the dark. She looked at the ceiling too. "Yes, I promise you we are." The first week was about survival and assessment. Catherine drove into the nearest town, a small place called Pinewood, 12 miles down the county road, and bought the cheapest cleaning supplies she could find. Broom mop, garbage bags, a box of basic tools, a utility knife. She spent 2 days doing nothing but removing debris from the ground floor, bag after bag carried out and piled at the edge of the property. She found rhythm in the work, the same way she always had in physical labor, the kind of rhythm that quiets the thinking mind and lets the body take over. She set up a camp stove on the kitchen counter for heating water and simple meals. She located the water shutoff and the electrical panel, both disconnected, both needing professional attention before either could be safely restored. She patched 2 broken ground floor windows with plastic sheeting and duct tape to keep wind and animals out. She propped the front porch supports with lumber she found in the barn. Not a fix, but enough to stop the lean from getting worse before she could address it properly. By the end of the first week, the ground floor was clear of debris, and she could walk through every room without stepping over something. The house felt different when it was clean. It breathed differently. It had a quality she hadn't been able to feel through all the mess. Something solid and purposeful in the way it was laid out, the way each room connected to the next. It was during the second week that it started. Catherine was in the living room, running her hand along the wall beside the fireplace, checking the plaster for soft spots that might indicate water damage or structural issues behind it. She pressed her palm flat against the wall and felt it. Not softness, not damage, something else entirely. A seam, straight, deliberate, running vertically from about knee height to above her head. Not a crack, not settling. A seam that had been plastered over and painted, intentionally concealed, but unmistakably there. She pressed harder. The wall gave slightly, not collapsing, but flexing in a way that solid plaster over solid framing should not flex. Catherine stepped back and looked at the wall with completely different eyes. She ran her flashlight along it slowly, and now that she was looking, she could see it. A rectangle roughly 3 feet wide and 5 feet tall, plastered and painted to match the surrounding wall so closely that you would never notice it unless you were looking for something wrong. Someone had put something behind that wall, and someone had gone to considerable effort to make sure nobody would ever know it was there. Catherine stood very still in the quiet farmhouse with her flashlight on that rectangle of wall and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not fear, not desperation. Something closer to the feeling you get at the very beginning of something when you don't yet know what it is, but every instinct you have is telling you to pay attention. She went to find a hammer. The hammer was an old one she'd found in the barn, its handle worn smooth from decades of use, its head solid and heavy. Catherine stood before that plastered rectangle in the living room wall and held it for a long moment before she swung. The first strike punched through the plaster easily, sending a small cloud of white dust into the air. She pulled the hammer back and swung again, widening the hole. Then she stopped and shone her flashlight into the gap she'd made. Behind the plaster was not insulation or framing or the dark empty cavity she'd expected. Behind the plaster was wood, old wood, dark with age, fitted together with careful precision. Planks running horizontally, smooth and close-joined, clearly not structural, clearly something built deliberately and then hidden. Catherine worked carefully now, removing plaster in sections rather than swinging hard, pulling chunks away with her hands and setting them down quietly, as though the noise might disturb whatever was back there. It took 20 minutes to clear enough plaster to understand what she was looking at. It was a cabinet built directly into the wall cavity, framed out and fitted with horizontal shelves running the full height and width of the rectangle she'd identified. The wood was dark walnut, old-growth, dense, and fine-grained in a way that modern lumber simply wasn't. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Each shelf was level and smooth, fitted with wooden pegs rather than nails. The joinery tight and clean, even after what must have been decades sealed inside that wall. And on the shelves, wrapped carefully in cloth that had gone stiff and brown with age, were objects. Catherine reached in and lifted the nearest one, unwrapped it slowly. It was a glass bottle, dark, amber hand, blown with an irregular shape that no machine had ever made. She set it down carefully and reached for another. A ceramic pitcher cream-colored with a blue painted pattern around its middle. The kind of folk art pottery that American craftsmen made in the early 1800s. Another cloth revealed a small wooden box with a brass latch, and inside it, nested in deteriorated velvet, a collection of antique coins. She lifted one to her flashlight. The date stamped into the metal read 1847. She sat back on her heels and looked at what was in front of her. She was not an antiques expert. She had no particular knowledge of collectibles or historical artifacts, but she understood enough to understand that what she was looking at was not junk. These objects had been wrapped carefully and hidden deliberately. Someone had built a concealed cabinet inside a wall of this farmhouse and filled it with things they considered worth protecting. Rachel appeared in the doorway while Catherine was still kneeling on the floor, surrounded by unwrapped objects. Her eyes went wide. "What is all that?" She came and crouched beside her mother, picking up the ceramic pitcher carefully with both hands. The way she handled things she understood were fragile. It was hidden behind the wall. Someone hid all of this inside the wall a very long time ago. Brian came in behind his sister, saw the hole in the plaster, and immediately wanted to help make it bigger. Catherine redirected him to holding the flashlight instead, which he accepted with great seriousness. They spent the rest of that afternoon documenting everything. Catherine photographed each object before and after unwrapping it, using her phone with the flashlight propped against the wall to get clear images. The cabinet held 23 objects in total. Glass bottles of various sizes, all hand-blown. 4 pieces of ceramic pottery, each hand-painted. The coin collection, which alone contained over 60 individual coins, ranging in date from the 1820s to the 1880s. A small oil lamp with an intact glass chimney. 2 hand-carved wooden figures, folk art, one a horse and one a human figure, both showing exceptional detail. And at the very back of the lowest shelf, wrapped in 2 layers of cloth, and then in a piece of old leather, tied with a cord, a journal. The journal was small, bound in brown leather, gone dark and stiff with age. Catherine untied the cord with careful fingers and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat and deliberate, in the style of someone who had learned penmanship formally in an earlier era. The ink had faded to a pale brown, but was entirely legible. At the top of the first page, in careful letters, a name, William Hayes, and below it, a date, April 1888. Catherine sat on the dusty floor of the farmhouse with her 2 children on either side of her and read the first entry by the light of her phone. The voice that came off those pages was precise and careful, the voice of a man who chose his words deliberately and meant every one of them. William Hayes had been a craftsman, a furniture maker and woodworker who had built this farmhouse with his own hands in 1871 and lived in it for the rest of his life. He had never married. He had no children. And in the spring of 1888, sensing that his health was failing, he had made a decision about the objects he'd collected and made over a lifetime of skilled work. He had decided to hide them, not out of fear exactly, but out of what he called, in his own words, a desire to keep them from those who would sell them without understanding what they were. He believed the right person would find them eventually. He wrote that he had faith in the house to hold them until that person came. He listed every object he'd placed in the cabinet, described each one recorded where several of the pieces had come from and what they'd cost him in time and material and care. Catherine read slowly, turning pages with the tips of her fingers. When she finished the last entry, she sat quietly for a long moment. Then she looked at the objects arranged on the floor around her and understood something that made her breath catch. These weren't just old things. William Hayes had been a craftsman of serious skill, working in a period when American folk art and handmade objects were produced at a quality that the modern world had largely stopped creating. The coins alone, based on the dates and the brief description she could find by searching her phone in the weak signal available out here, could be worth significant money. The pottery, the glass, the carved figures, the lamp. She needed an expert. She needed someone who knew what they were looking at. But what nobody knew, not her siblings laughing in that law office, not the county that condemned this house, was that her father Robert had left her this place for a reason reaching back 136 years. A reason even Catherine didn't understand yet. A reason that would prove he knew exactly what he was doing when he wrote that will. That night, Catherine examined the 2 photographs Edward Harrison had given her again. The current condemned farmhouse and the photo of young Robert standing in front of the same house, maintained and whole in what looked like the late 1970s. She turned the older photograph over. The faded pencil writing on the back read, Robert Anderson, age 24, summer 1977, Willow Creek family home. Family home. Catherine sat very still. Robert didn't just buy this house at auction. He had lived here as a young man, but how the Hayes family had built it, unless there was a connection she wasn't seeing. She grabbed William's journal and flipped to the last page. William Hayes wrote about his sister's children scattered now to other states. No direct heirs of his own. Catherine pulled out her phone. The signal was weak but persistent. She searched for Anderson family genealogy for Robert Anderson and his mother. It took 15 minutes of frustration and dropped connections before she found it. Robert Anderson's mother was Sarah Hayes Anderson, born 1928, died 2003. Sarah Hayes was descended from William Hayes's sister. Robert was William's distant descendant. The house had been in the family passed down through generations, then lost when Robert's mother had to sell it in the 1980s, and then Robert had bought it back at a tax auction for $9 in 2016. The entire inheritance was a legacy restoration. Robert knew about the cabinet because his mother had told him as a child. He'd never opened it, never verified. He'd bought the house back, condemned as it was, and left it to the one child who would have the courage to look. Catherine sat in the darkness, holding the journal and the photograph. Her father's faith in her wasn't just that she would survive, it was that she would discover. He had given her a quest, a treasure hunt through time, a connection to ancestors she never knew she had. She cried for the first time since Robert had died. Not from grief, from understanding. The morning after the discovery, Catherine drove into Pinewood with the journal, 3 of the ceramic pieces carefully wrapped in clean cloth, and the coin collection sealed in a plastic bag. She'd searched online the night before, using the farmhouse's weak signal, and found an antiques dealer in town named Harlan Collectibles, a small shop on the main street that had been operating for over 30 years, according to its faded window lettering. The owner, a compact and precise woman in her late 60s named Patricia Clark, looked at what Catherine set on her counter and went very still, in the way that people with genuine expertise go still when they encounter something that commands their full attention. Patricia examined each ceramic piece under a magnifying glass without speaking. She turned the coins over one by one, setting certain ones aside in a separate, careful pile. She read 3 pages of William Hayes's journal with a focused expression. Then she took off her magnifying glass and looked at Catherine directly. "Where did you get these?" Catherine told her. "The farmhouse on Willow Creek Road, Robert Anderson's property." Patricia sat down on the stool behind her counter. Long quiet. "Yes, he was my father. He left it to me." The ceramic pieces are Tennessee pottery. Mid-1800s regional folk art from a tradition that produced very few surviving examples in this condition. Museum quality. The coins include several that are genuinely rare. I need a specialist to confirm, but my preliminary assessment is that the collection as a whole is substantial. The journal, if it's authentic, and I believe it is a primary historical document. William Hayes was a known figure in Harlan County craft history. There are 2 of his pieces in the State Museum in Nashville. Catherine absorbed the words steadily, no visible reaction until she'd had time to understand what she was being told. "What are we talking about in terms of value?" Patricia folded her hands on the counter. "I want a full appraisal done by a qualified specialist before I give you any numbers. But speaking as someone who's been in this business for 31 years, I don't think you should sell anything until you know exactly what you have. What I can tell you is that you should treat those objects as serious assets and handle them accordingly." Catherine drove back to the farmhouse with Patricia's card and the name of an appraiser in Nashville who specialized in American folk art and historical artifacts. She had called ahead from the parking lot outside the shop and made an appointment for the following week. She had also, for the first time since leaving Memphis 6 weeks ago, allowed herself to feel something cautiously approaching hope. But hope without work was just wishing. And Catherine had never been a person who wished. She was a person who worked. 3 weeks after Catherine found William Hayes's cabinet, Dr. Timothy Morrison drove down from Nashville in a silver sedan that looked out of place on the gravel roads of Harlan County. He was a careful, methodical man in his early 50s who specialized in 19th century American material culture, and he arrived at the farmhouse with 2 leather cases and an expression that suggested he'd seen enough amateur discoveries to be skeptical of anything until he'd verified it himself. He spent 4 hours going through every object, photographing each one from multiple angles, cross-referencing against records he'd brought on a tablet, making notes in a leather-bound notebook with the kind of quiet intensity that made Catherine understand this was not a man who rushed to conclusions. Rachel sat nearby at the kitchen table, doing homework, occasionally glancing up to watch the stranger handle her mother's treasures. Brian had fallen asleep on the living room floor with the wooden horse tucked under his arm, exhausted from a morning spent helping Catherine clear debris from the barn. When Dr. Morrison finally closed his notebook, he looked at Catherine with the composed expression of a professional delivering significant news. "Miss Anderson, I want to be precise because precision matters here. The ceramic collection is exceptional. Pieces in this condition from this regional tradition are essentially museum quality. The coin collection includes 3 coins that I would classify as genuinely rare, and one that I need to send photographs to a colleague to confirm, but my working estimate is conservative." The carved figures are fine examples of Tennessee folk sculpture. The glass is period correct, and the hand-blown quality is excellent. The journal is a primary document of real historical significance. He opened his notebook to a page of figures and turned it toward her. This is my preliminary range. Final appraisal will take several weeks and involve 2 additional specialists. But I want you to have a working number so you understand what you're dealing with. Catherine looked at the page. The range Dr. Morrison had written covered the collection as a whole. The low end of his estimate was $340,000. The high end was $480,000. She read those numbers twice. Then she looked up at Dr. Morrison. He nodded once, confirming what she'd read. Outside the farmhouse windows, the Tennessee fields were green and wide, and entirely indifferent to the fact that everything had just changed. News travels in small towns the way water moves through limestone, slowly at first through invisible channels, and then suddenly everywhere. Patricia Clark was professional and told no one, but someone had seen Catherine leave the antique shop with Dr. Morrison's business card 3 weeks earlier. Someone else noticed Nashville plates parked at Willow Creek Road for 4 hours on a Tuesday afternoon. By the weekend, the Pinewood Diner was thick with coffee and speculation. Martinez girl found something valuable in that old Hayes place. Heard it was Civil War gold. No antiques. Pottery or something. $500,000, I heard. The numbers inflated and deflated and mutated through retelling until nobody knew exactly what was true, but everyone agreed that Catherine Anderson had found something and that something was worth serious money. The town divided along predictable lines. Some were genuinely happy for her. Kenneth Cooper, a semi-retired carpenter in his early 60s who'd done work on half the houses in Pinewood over 40 years, drove past the farmhouse one afternoon and saw Catherine on the roof, patching damaged shingles with material she'd salvaged from the barn. He pulled into the drive and stood at the base of the ladder, looking up. "You know what you're doing up there." Catherine didn't stop working, learning. He watched her for another minute, then went to his truck and got his own tool belt. He came back and climbed the ladder. "Move over. I'll show you the right way." Kenneth returned 4 more times over the following 2 weeks, always unannounced, always bringing something useful. A box of roofing nails, a tube of weatherproof sealant. Once, a whole sheet of plywood he claimed was left over from another job. He never asked for payment and deflected every time Catherine tried to offer something in return. He mentioned once that he had a daughter about her age and left it at that. The daughter was Laura Cooper, 38, a nurse at Pinewood Medical Center who'd been divorced for 2 years and lived alone in a small house on the east side of town. She drove to the farmhouse one evening after her shift, still in scrubs, carrying a basket with homemade bread, a jar of honey, and coloring books for Rachel and Brian. "Dad told me about you. Wanted to meet the woman brave enough to take on the Hayes place. She stayed 2 hours on the newly stabilized porch. Rachel showed her the carved horse. Brian demonstrated his expertise with the camp stove, which consisted mainly of turning the knob on and off repeatedly until Laura gently suggested he might save the propane. Before she left, Laura squeezed Catherine's hand. "This town's watching you. Some are skeptical, but most are rooting for you, me included." She became Catherine's first real friend in Pinewood, someone who understood what it meant to rebuild a life from pieces that didn't quite fit together anymore. Margaret Wilson, a retired teacher in her mid-70s who lived 3 miles down the road, arrived one Saturday morning with a casserole dish covered in foil and 2 juice boxes for the children. She said she'd heard about the woman fixing up the old Hayes farmhouse and wanted to see for herself. She stayed long enough to watch Rachel draw pictures of the house and to listen to Brian's detailed explanation of why the barn was definitely haunted, but in a friendly way. Before she left, she pressed Catherine's hand, and her voice went quiet. "That house has been waiting for someone like you for a very long time. Not everyone was supportive. Some locals muttered about outsiders coming in and suddenly striking it rich. The county assessor made noises about reevaluating property taxes. Real estate vultures started calling with offers to help, which really meant offers to buy cheap, before Catherine understood what she had. And there were the ones who watched with the particular resentment that comes from seeing someone else get lucky when you never have. But Catherine kept working. She attacked the most urgent structural issues with the kind of focused determination that had gotten her through 6 weeks in a car. The front porch had to be stabilized before it became dangerous. She found 4 solid timber posts in the collapsed barn, dragged them to the front of the house, one at a time, and used them to shore up the porch supports. The work took 2 full days and left her shoulders aching in a way that felt permanent. But when she was done, the porch was level and solid, and the lean was gone. She tackled the boarded window next, pulling away the plywood from inside and outside, clearing broken glass with gloves she'd improvised from duct tape wrapped around her hands. The effect was immediate. Light poured into the ground floor rooms in a way that changed their entire character. The living room, with its high ceiling and wide fireplace, became something else when morning sun came through those windows. Not perfect, not finished, but beautiful in the way that honest old structures are beautiful when the light finds them correctly. The phone call came on a Thursday. Catherine was in the barn trying to determine which sections of timber could be salvaged and which were too far gone. Nashville number. She didn't recognize it, but answered anyway. Christopher, voice careful, measured, different from the law office. Catherine. I've been thinking about the farmhouse. She waited, leaning against a barn post that had somehow stayed vertical through everything. About what you found inside. I want you to know I'm happy for you. Really. Pause. Long enough that Catherine could hear traffic in the background, but I've also been talking to a lawyer, and there's some questions about estate law that need addressing. Catherine set down the timber plank she'd been examining. What questions? The artifacts were part of Dad's estate when he died. They should have been inventoried. The fact that they weren't doesn't mean they're suddenly only yours. They were hidden inside a wall of a property he left to me. A property he bought 8 years before he died. He had to know about them, Catherine. Think about it. He buys a condemned farmhouse for $9 and never sells it, never fixes it, leaves it specifically to you in the will. He knew what was inside. The accusation landed like a physical thing. If he knew and didn't disclose it to his other beneficiaries, that's estate fraud. Or if you influenced him during those years, you were taking care of him. Catherine's throat closed. Don't. I'm not saying you did anything wrong. I'm saying a court might look at it differently. You were the only one who spent time with him those last years. You had access opportunity. I took care of our father when no one else would. And now you have $500,000 for it. I'm just saying there's optics. The word optics hung in the air between them like something toxic. Look, this doesn't have to get ugly. Stephanie and we've talked. If you voluntarily split the proceeds 3 ways, 1/3 each, we'll sign releases, no court, clean break. You still walk away with over $100,000, more than you've ever had. Catherine was silent. In the barn around her, dust motes drifted through shafts of afternoon light. Otherwise, we file a claim, even if you win, and that's if you're looking at tens of thousands in legal fees, 18 months of fighting. Is that what you want? What I want is for my family to believe I didn't manipulate a dying man for money. Then prove it. Split the proceeds. Show you're not being greedy. Catherine ended the call. She sat on the barn floor with her hands shaking. First time since finding the cabinet, she felt real fear. Not of poverty, of injustice, of having done everything right and still being punished for it. 2 days later, Stephanie called. Different approach, softer, more personal. She talked about their childhood, about their father, about how families can fracture over money, and I don't want that for us. She used the word unfair 3 times in the first 5 minutes, each time in reference to her own situation, not Catherine's. It just doesn't seem right that Dad left you something worth so much more than what Christopher and I got. I know he didn't mean it that way. He couldn't have known. But I think if he were here now, he'd want us to share equally. That's the kind of man he was. She suggested voluntary sharing, perhaps a third each, to demonstrate the kind of character Dad always hoped his children would have. Catherine listened to all of it. Then she spoke, and her voice was steady, in a way that surprised her. Dad demonstrated the character he hoped we'd have by the choices he made in his will. I'm going to honor those choices. Stephanie's softness evaporated like water on hot metal. You're being selfish. Catherine didn't argue. I'm being clear. There's a difference. She hung up and went back to work. 9 days after Christopher's call, the formal letter arrived. Certified mail, thick envelope, law firm letterhead. Davison and Holt attorneys at Law Nashville. On behalf of clients, Christopher and Stephanie Anderson jointly asserting claim to artifacts discovered at 47 Willow Creek Road. Grounds undisclosed estate assets inequitably distributed through omission. Request immediate cessation of any sale or transfer pending resolution. Catherine read it twice, photographed it, sent it to Edward Harrison. His response came within the hour. Expected. I'll handle response. Don't worry. She wasn't worried exactly. She was tired in the specific way people get tired when they've done everything right and still find themselves having to defend it. But she had faced harder things. A condemned building with 2 children and $200. 6 weeks in a car in winter, a wall that needed a hammer and the courage to swing it. Whatever Christopher and Stephanie sent her way next, she would face that too, directly and without flinching. But what nobody had prepared Catherine for was the possibility that the threats might come from multiple directions at once. The car pulled into the driveway on a Tuesday afternoon while Catherine was outside splitting firewood for the kitchen stove. New sedan Nashville rental plates, too clean for these roads. A man got out. Athletic build, careful smile eyes that calculated even when they pretended warmth. Stephen Walker, 39 years old, Catherine's ex-husband, left 3 years ago when Brian was 3. No child support, no contact, no birthday cards or phone calls or visits for the past 2 years. Catherine set down the axe, didn't move toward him. What are you doing here? Stephen, I heard about your situation. Wanted to see if I could help. My situation, the farmhouse, the discovery. Congratulations, by the way. How did you know? But she already knew the answer. Christopher had called him. Look, I know I haven't been around. I regret that. But I'm in a better place now. Stable job. Ooh. Stable job, apartment, ready to be a father. Catherine stared at him. The audacity of it. The sheer calculated audacity. I want joint custody, Catherine. Rachel and Brian deserve to have their father in their lives. You left. I made mistakes. I'm trying to make them right by showing up after you heard I have money. Stephen's smile tightened at the edges. That's cynical. That's accurate. He shifted tactics, and his voice went quieter, more dangerous. I've talked to a lawyer. Given your living situation the past few months, homeless children in a car now, in a condemned building, a family court might have concerns about stability. The threat was clear, crystal clear. I don't want to fight you, but I will if I have to. For my kids. Rachel appeared in the doorway behind Catherine, small voice cutting through the tension. Mom, Stephen saw her, and his face changed smile, going wide and false. Hey, Rachel, remember Dad? Rachel stepped closer to Catherine. Didn't respond, didn't smile back. Stephen's smile faltered. Brian came out too drawn by the unfamiliar voice. He looked at Stephen with no recognition on his face whatsoever. Hey, buddy, it's Dad. Brian looked up at Catherine, confused. Who is that? The moment stretched. Stephen realized his children didn't know him anymore. The calculation in his eyes shifted, recalibrating. Laura Cooper's truck pulled in, then gravel crunching. She'd been coming to drop off groceries, saw the confrontation playing out, read the body language. She parked and got out. Nurse Scrubs, tired from her shift, but eyes sharp and assessing. Everything okay here? Catherine felt a surge of gratitude so strong it almost undid her composure. Just fine. This man was leaving. Stephen looked at Laura. This is family business. Laura stepped beside Catherine, shoulder to shoulder. Families who shows up, you leaving or do I need to call my dad? Stephen knew when he was outmatched. Small-town dynamics meant he was the outsider, and they were community. I'll be back with legal papers. He drove away, gravel dust settling in the afternoon air. Laura put her arm around Catherine's shoulders. Who was that ex-husband? Left 3 years ago. Now wants custody because he heard about the money. Laura's jaw set. Not happening. I'll testify if needed. You're a good mother. Anyone with eyes can see that. Rachel and Brian clustered around Catherine. She kneeled and pulled them close. He can't take us right. Rachel's voice was barely audible. Catherine forced herself to feel the certainty she spoke. No one is taking you anywhere, I promise. But inside, new fear bloomed. Legal battle on 2 fronts now, Christopher and Stephanie for the artifacts, Stephen for the children. And Catherine had $214 in her bank account and a condemned farmhouse, and the fragile hope that doing the right thing might somehow be enough. It makes you think how many times we judge someone as an outsider, not belonging, just because they're new. How often we decide someone doesn't deserve what they have before we know their story. Catherine was about to learn that assumption cuts both ways, and sometimes the people watching aren't just judging. Sometimes they're planning. 3 nights after Stephen's visit, Catherine woke to a sound that didn't belong. The red numbers on her phone read 2:17 a.m. Not wind, not the house settling. Someone was inside. Her heart hammering, she reached for her phone. No signal. Still weak out here, and at this hour, non-existent. Driving to town for police meant 25 minutes. Whatever was happening would be over by then. She got up silently, woke Rachel and Brian with a hand over each mouth so they wouldn't make noise, whispered instructions. Stay here, lock the door behind me, don't come out unless I say. Rachel's eyes went huge in the darkness, but she nodded. Catherine took her flashlight and the axe she kept for splitting wood. Downstairs, 2 men in the living room, flashlights. One had a crowbar and was working on the wall beside the fireplace right where the cabinet had been. They were looking for more hidden compartments, looking for treasures Catherine hadn't found yet. Her fear converted to rage in the space of a heartbeat. She stepped into the doorway and turned on her flashlight, shining it directly in their faces. "Get out of my house." Both men spun. Early 30s, rough clothes, the kind of men who did day labor when they could find it, and other things when they couldn't. The one with the crowbar sneered. "Your house? You've been here, what, a month? This ain't yours. It's my property. You're trespassing. Leave now, or I'm calling the sheriff." The other man laughed. "No signal out here, lady." "We know." They started toward her. Catherine raised the axe. The weight of it, the solid reality of it in her hands, steadied something in her chest. "I said, get out." The man with the crowbar hesitated. "Woman alone." 2 men. But she was holding that axe like she knew how to use it. Like she'd split enough wood to understand exactly how much force it took to break something. Sound from upstairs. Rachel's voice, scared, breaking the agreed silence. "Mom." Everything changed. The man with the crowbar heard a child's voice, and something shifted in his expression. Even criminals have lines, and whatever he was willing to do to Catherine alone, he wasn't willing to do in front of a 9-year-old girl. The other man nervous now. "Come on, let's go. Not worth it." The man with the crowbar backed toward the window they'd broken to enter. "This isn't over. You don't belong here." Catherine's voice came out steel. "This is exactly where I belong, and if you come back, I won't warn you twice." They left through the window. Catherine bolted all doors, boarded the broken window from inside with plywood and nails, her hand shaking so hard she bent 2 nails before getting one to hold. Rachel and Brian came downstairs, and she pulled them close, holding them until the shaking stopped. "Are they gone?" "Yes, they're gone." Dawn broke before any of them slept again. Kenneth arrived for planned work that morning, saw the newly boarded window, Catherine's exhausted face. "What happened?" she told him. His expression went hard. "They were locals. I can find out who." "No, let the sheriff handle it. Sheriff's department is 30 minutes away, Catherine. By the time they get here, I'm not starting a war with this town, Kenneth. But I'm also not leaving." He looked at her with something new in his eyes. Respect, maybe. Or recognition. "No. I don't imagine you are." Laura arrived within the hour, having heard about it through the mysterious network that connected everyone in Pinewood. "Stay with me for a while. My place has security system closer to town." Catherine was tempted but shook her head. "If I leave now, they win. They're trying to scare me away. I won't give them that. Then I'm staying here nights until this settles." Catherine started to protest. Laura cut her off. "Not asking permission. Dad and I will take shifts. You're not alone in this." News of the break-in spread through Pinewood faster than the news of the discovery had. The town that had been divided found new lines. Margaret Wilson organized a night watch rotation with other neighbors. Hayes' house protected now. Even the ones who'd been skeptical about Catherine didn't condone breaking and entering. But the real protection came from Edward Harrison, who drove to the farmhouse 2 days after the break-in with a briefcase full of strategy. They sat at the kitchen table over coffee while Rachel did homework, and Brian built elaborate structures with firewood scraps. Edward spread legal papers between them. Christopher and Stephanie's claim has no legal merit. But lack of merit doesn't mean they won't push it. He explained the mechanics. Their argument, rested on the artifacts being undisclosed estate assets subject to equitable distribution. The reality was that contents discovered after title transferred belonged to the title holder under Tennessee property law. But they're not filing to win. They're filing to create pressure, generate legal costs, wear you down. What would a defense cost, Edward was honest, if they pushed to discovery significant? Potentially $50,000 or more. Against a collection worth $400,000, it was meaningful but not ruinous. Still real money. Edward's strategy involved affidavits. Robert's physician documenting mental clarity. Robert's neighbor testifying to no undue influence. Rehabilitation facility staff recording Robert's repeated pride in Catherine's dedication. Visit records showing Christopher and Stephanie's absence for 2 full years. We show pattern. You cared. They didn't. Robert rewarded accordingly. Then Edward produced a document Catherine hadn't seen. An affidavit Robert had signed 6 months before he died, specifically addressing the Willow Creek property. The language was precise and deliberate. Property left to Catherine, including all structures, all land, and all contents, therein known and unknown. Known and unknown. Edward tapped the phrase, precise language chosen to cover exactly this situation. Your father anticipated a legal challenge. He took steps to foreclose it. Catherine looked at her father's signature on the document. He had protected her even from beyond the grave, believed in her enough to build a wall against the very scenario playing out now. 2 weeks after the preliminary estimate, Dr. Morrison returned with his completed evaluation. 2 specialist colleagues accompanied him, a coin expert from Chicago, a pottery expert from Charleston. They spent an entire afternoon going through everything again, conferring in low voices, making detailed notes. The final report put the total collection value at $418,000. The ceramic collection alone was worth $145,000. The coin collection with 3 extraordinarily rare specimens came to $187,000. The carved figures, $48,000. Glass bottles and lamp, $23,000. The journal, valued for its historical significance and museum interest, $15,000. Dr. Morrison had buyers ready if Catherine wanted to sell. Or he could broker an auction. Her choice on timeline. I can't sell until the legal situation resolves. Dr. Morrison understood. When you're ready, I'll facilitate. No pressure. He gave her a contact list. Private collectors, auction houses, museums interested in the journal, resources she'd need when the time came. It was Rachel who found the second discovery. A Saturday afternoon, Rachel playing in the living room while Catherine worked on kitchen plumbing. Rachel noticed a floorboard near the fireplace, sitting slightly raised, not quite flush with the others. 9-year-old curiosity made her wiggle. It lifted. Small cavity underneath, an oilcloth package inside. Mom, I found something. Catherine came running, saw the package, felt her pulse spike, carefully opened the oilcloth. Inside was another item from William Hayes, a small wooden box different from the coin box. Inside that box, 2 things. A wedding ring, simple gold band engraved inside WH to MC 1869, and a folded letter paper, brittle ink, faded but legible. Catherine read aloud to Rachel, her voice breaking halfway through. To whoever finds this house standing, I built this home for a bride who never came. Margaret Connor promised to me in spring of 1869, took ill that winter, and passed before we could wed. I kept her ring, kept this house, though it was meant for a family I never had. I have no children of my own, but my sister's children carry my blood. If you are reading this, perhaps you are one of them. Perhaps you are the family this house was always meant to hold. I leave you the work of my hands and the treasures I have made. Use them wisely, use them well, and know that you are home. William Hayes, April 1888. Rachel was crying by the end. He built it for us, didn't he? We're the family. Catherine pulled her close, both of them crying now. Yes, baby, we're the family. The house wasn't just shelter. It was legacy, built for love that didn't arrive, preserved for family that did. Robert had known the story, known the connection, known that Catherine was William Hayes' distant descendant meant to complete a circle 153 years in the making. The weight of that legacy settled around Catherine like a mantle, like armor, like proof that some things are worth fighting for even when the fight seems impossible. That night, Catherine sat on the porch after Rachel and Brian had fallen asleep. The fields were dark around her, and the stars were thick overhead, and she could hear the creek running at the back edge of the property. She thought about William Hayes building this house in 1871 for a woman who never arrived, about Robert buying it back for $9 in 2016, about herself finding the cabinet in 2024, 153 years of waiting. Christopher and Stephanie could file their claim. Stephen could petition for custody. Men could break into her house in the night. But this house had chosen her the same way it had chosen William, the same way it had held on through fire and neglect and decades of abandonment, waiting for the right person to see what it was. What Catherine didn't know yet was that the courtroom battles would be easier than what came after. Because winning against your family doesn't feel like winning at all. It feels like standing alone in the ruins of something that used to matter and trying to decide if you're relieved or just empty. The Harlan County Courthouse sat on Pinewood's main square, a solid brick structure that smelled of floor wax and old wood and the particular institutional quiet of places where serious things get decided. Catherine arrived early on a Thursday morning in late October with Edward Harrison, who'd driven down from Clarksville the night before and stayed at the Highway Motel rather than make the drive twice. His briefcase contained everything Robert Anderson had ever written or communicated about his will, organized with the kind of thoroughness that suggested a man who'd been preparing for exactly this fight. Christopher and Stephanie arrived together with two attorneys from Davison and Holt. Both younger than Catherine expected, both carrying the careful confidence of people who'd been told their case was solid. Christopher wore a dark suit and looked straight ahead. Stephanie wore gray and looked at Catherine once in the hallway with an expression that wanted to communicate regret, but mostly communicated anxiety about what was coming. Judge Barbara Thomas had a reputation in Harlan County for moving through cases efficiently and tolerating very little she considered a waste of the court's time. She was 62, steel-haired, and had presided over family disputes long enough to recognize the difference between genuine legal questions and sibling warfare dressed up in legal language. The motion Christopher and Stephanie had filed argued that the artifacts constituted undisclosed estate assets that had been inequitably distributed through omission. Their lead attorney presented the case with the smooth delivery of someone who'd made similar arguments before. Your Honor, the pattern is clear. Mr. Robert Anderson purchased this specific property 8 years before his death for a nominal sum. He never renovated, never sold, never mentioned it to other beneficiaries. then leaves it and only it to one child, while the others receive liquid assets. Subsequent discovery of artifacts worth over $400,000 suggests Mr. Anderson knew what the property contained. This constitutes inequitable distribution through material omission. The second argument came harder, sharper. Furthermore, Miss Anderson was the sole family member with access to Mr. Anderson in his final years. She provided care, managed medications, made decisions. The disproportionate nature of this bequest warrants scrutiny of circumstances under which the will was executed. Catherine sat beside Edward with her face still. She'd known this was coming, had prepared herself for it. But hearing someone argue in a public courtroom that she'd manipulated a dying man for money, that her years of care had been strategy rather than love, landed like a physical blow. It reduced something real and painful and difficult to a legal tactic. That reduction was its own kind of violence. Edward Harrison responded without raising his voice. He never did. Volume wasn't his weapon. Precision was. He submitted the physician's affidavit first, documentation of Robert's mental clarity until the final stroke, strong will, explicit statements about his pride in Catherine's dedication, zero indication that his decisions were influenced by anything except his own clear judgment. Next came the rehabilitation facility records, staff testimony showing Robert's repeated statements over 18 months. Catherine is the only one who cares. She deserves everything. Edward didn't editorialize. Let the records speak for themselves. The neighbor's affidavit followed. 12 years living next door to Robert. Testimony about how Robert often spoke of making things right with his will, ensuring each child gets what they actually earned. Then, the visit records. Documentation showing Christopher had visited his father 0 times in the final 2 years. Stephanie, 0 times. Catherine, 14 documented visits, averaging a 6-hour drive each way. Edward simply placed the records in evidence and moved on. The defense counsel tried to argue that known and unknown was vague language that couldn't cover artifacts of significant undisclosed value. Edward's response was surgical. Your Honor, known and unknown is precise language chosen deliberately to cover exactly this eventuality. The testator's intent could not have been stated more clearly without his having opened the wall himself and photographed the contents. Are we now arguing that a mentally competent man cannot leave his property as he sees fit simply because one asset appreciates beyond expectations? Every parent who leaves a child a house that later increases in value would face retrospective lawsuits under that theory. The courtroom went quiet, not the quiet of anticipation, but the quiet of inevitability when the outcome becomes clear to everyone present before it's officially stated. Christopher's jaw was tight. Stephanie had stopped taking notes 20 minutes earlier and was staring at the table in front of her. Edward produced his final document, the affidavit Robert had signed 6 months before his death, specifically addressing the Willow Creek property. Judge Thomas read it carefully, set it down, looked at the opposing counsel over her reading glasses with an expression that required no interpretation. The claim of undisclosed estate assets is not supported by the language of the will or the documented intent of the testator. The claim of undue influence is not supported by any evidence presented, and is in fact directly contradicted by substantial documentation provided by the defense. The motion is denied in its entirety. She said it in a measured, final tone, the voice of someone closing a door that would not be opened again. Then she looked at Christopher and Stephanie's attorneys. "I hope your clients understand that the court's time is a shared resource." The gavel came down. Outside, the October air was cold and bright. Maples along the main square had gone fully red. Christopher and Stephanie emerged a minute after Catherine and Edward. Their attorneys were already on phones. Christopher looked at Catherine across the courthouse steps with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not calculation, not contempt, not the careful friendliness of someone working toward something, just a man standing in the cold, looking at his sister, with nothing left to say that would make any difference. Stephanie spoke first, voice quiet, almost lost in the wind. "I'm sorry for all of it." Catherine looked at her. Believed the apology was real, or as real as Stephanie could make it under the circumstances. That matters. It just doesn't change anything. She turned and walked with Edward to his car. Behind her, Christopher said something to Stephanie in a low voice. Stephanie responded. Then, nothing. Catherine didn't look back. In the car they sat for a moment before Catherine got out. Edward spoke quietly. "Your father would be proud, the same thing he'd said at the will reading. It meant more the second time. The custody hearing came 3 days later, different courtroom, more informal, but no less serious. Judge Linda Wright specialized in family court and had seen every manipulation parents attempted when money entered the equation. She was 54 and had precisely 0 patience for absent fathers who suddenly discovered paternal instincts when financial incentives appeared. Stephen's petition argued for joint custody based on Catherine's housing instability and his newfound readiness to parent. His attorney presented the case with rehearsed sympathy. Miss Anderson subjected minor children to homelessness for 6 weeks, currently residing in a structure recently under county condemnation order. Financial instability documented. Mr. Walker seeks joint custody to provide stable environment. Stephen took the stand, testified with careful remorse. "I made mistakes. I left. I regret that deeply. But I'm ready now to be a father. Stable job apartment, ready to provide." Edward Harrison's cross-examination was brief and devastating. "Mr. Walker, when did you last see your children?" "About 2 years ago." "And in those 2 years, how much child support have you paid?" Stephen hesitated. "I had financial difficulties." "The amount, Mr. Walker?" "0." "When did you first contact Miss Anderson about resuming a parental relationship?" 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks after news of her financial discovery became public. "That's not why." No further questions. Catherine took the stand and testified steadily. Yes, they'd lived in a car for 6 weeks. Yes, the current house had been condemned, but I have never missed a meal for my children, never missed a doctor's appointment, never let them feel unsafe. The car was temporary. The house is being renovated. I'm fixing it with my own hands because that's what you do when you're a parent. You build something better. She looked directly at Judge Wright. "Mr. Walker left when Brian was 3. Brian doesn't remember him. Rachel barely does. They haven't received a birthday card, a phone call, a visit in 2 years. Now he appears because he heard I have money, and suddenly he wants to be a father." Judge Wright leaned forward. "What do your children want, Miss Anderson?" "Rachel told me she doesn't know him." Brian asked who he was. "They don't want a stranger in their lives just because he has legal claim to the title father." Laura Cooper testified as a character witness. Her nurse's training made her testimony clinical and unassailable. "I work with children daily. I've spent time at Miss Anderson's home. Those kids are loved, cared for, thriving. She's teaching them resilience work ethic, how to build something from nothing. Mr. Walker is a stranger to them. This isn't about children's welfare, it's about money. Kenneth Cooper followed. His testimony was shorter, but carried weight in a town where everyone knew him. I've watched Catherine rebuild that farmhouse with her bare hands. Most men I know couldn't do what she's done. Her children watch her work, help where they can learn what real parenting looks like. That's not instability, that's strength. Judge Wright's ruling was swift. Mr. Walker's petition for joint custody is denied. His 2-year absence, lack of financial support, and timing of this petition suggest motivations unrelated to children's best interests. Miss Anderson has demonstrated capability and dedication. Mr. Walker may petition for supervised visitation after establishing a pattern of support and involvement, but that's not today's matter. Petition denied. The gavel fell for the second time that week. Stephen left, quickly. Didn't look at Rachel and Brian waiting outside the courtroom with Margaret Wilson, who'd volunteered to watch them. The children ran to Catherine when she emerged. She knelt and pulled them close. He's gone. He's gone. But winning didn't feel like triumph. It felt like standing in the ruins of relationships that used to mean something and realizing you were relieved they were over. Catherine had fought for what was hers and won both battles, but the cost was a family that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Sometimes the right thing and the good thing aren't the same thing at all. The artifact sale happened in stages over the next 3 months. Catherine had decided early she wouldn't rush and wouldn't accept first offers. The right buyers were worth finding. Dr. Morrison handled the negotiations with the same careful precision he brought to everything. The ceramic collection sold to a private collector in Charleston who'd been searching for 11 years for a complete set of Tennessee folk pottery in this condition. The price landed at the high end of Dr. Morrison's range, $145,000. The coin collection split between 2 buyers. A numismatic specialist in Chicago paid $112,000 for the bulk of the collection. A private collector in Virginia wanted the 3 rarest coins specifically and paid $75,000 for just those 3. The carved wooden figures went to a folk art gallery in Asheville, planning a permanent exhibition on Tennessee sculpture. $48,000 and a promise that William Hayes's name would be displayed prominently. The glass bottles and oil lamps sold through a specialist auction house in Nashville that handled 19th century American domestic objects. $23,000. The journal required the most deliberate transaction. Catherine had conversations with 4 institutions before accepting an offer from the Tennessee State Museum in Nashville. They wanted it for their permanent collection of regional craft history documents. They also wanted to borrow the carved figures for proper documentation and expressed interest in mounting an exhibition around William Hayes' life and work. Catherine negotiated carefully. The sale would include a named display crediting William Hayes and the farmhouse at 47 Willow Creek Road. The museum agreed without hesitation. $15,000 for the journal, plus funding for the exhibition that would tell William's story to people who would understand what it meant. When Dr. Morrison sent the final accounting summary, the total came to $418,000. After his fee and the various auction house commissions, Catherine received $371,000. She sat at the kitchen table where William Hayes had once sat and looked at the number on her phone screen, the largest number ever associated with her name in any context that wasn't debt. She didn't cry. She sat very still and let it become real at the pace it needed to become real. This was the moment everything could change. The moment she could walk away, start fresh somewhere else, leave the farmhouse and Pinewood and Tennessee behind. Instead, she called the Harlan County Building Department and requested a meeting with the county inspector to begin the formal process of having the condemnation order reviewed and lifted. The first use of her money wasn't debt payoff, though she had some. Wasn't a new car, though hers desperately needed replacing. The first thing Catherine did was hire Kenneth Cooper to oversee the renovation work, which he accepted with the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd been hoping she would ask. She hired locally for everything she could, fair wages, took time to explain to each person what she was trying to preserve and why. The cast-iron stove was restored by a specialist Kenneth knew in Knoxville who worked with antique appliances. The wide plank floors were cleaned and refinished by hand, every original board kept. The fireplace was repointed and the chimney rebuilt from the roofline up. The fire-damaged right side of the house represented the largest undertaking. New framing, new exterior walls, but Kenneth was meticulous about matching materials and methods to the original construction. He found reclaimed timber from a demolished barn 2 counties over that matched the age and grain of William's original work. The new walls were structurally modern, but aesthetically faithful to 1871. The barn was rebuilt over 6 weeks in early spring, using timber milled from trees that had come down on the property during a winter storm. Catherine had set those trees aside specifically for this purpose, understanding even then that waste was a luxury she couldn't afford. The new barn was structurally sound, but built to look as it had in William Hayes's time. Board and batten siding, gambrel roof, wide doors opening south to catch the morning light. The collapsed fence was replaced with split rail sourced from a farm clearing cedar posts. The yard was cleared and planted with a kitchen garden along the south wall, herbs and vegetables in raised beds built from reclaimed lumber. Catherine had read in William's journal about the garden his mother had kept in exactly that location. She was building it back the way it had been, the way it was always meant to be. Margaret Wilson came to see the finished farmhouse on a Saturday in late April, the same day the county inspector signed off on lifting the condemnation order. She stood on the front porch, which was now solid and level and painted white, and looked at the house and the yard and the barn and the fields beyond with the expression of someone watching something be restored to what it always deserved to be. This is what it looked like in the old photographs from when the Hayes family lived here. This is exactly what it looked like. Catherine stood beside her and looked Tuscan too. She'd never seen those old photographs, but somehow she'd built it back to the same place anyway. Some things you inherit in your blood rather than your memory. The open house that evening wasn't planned as a celebration, more as a simple acknowledgement that something had been completed, and the people who'd contributed deserved to see what they'd helped create. Kenneth came with his wife, Marie. Patricia Clark from Harlan Collectibles spent a long time in the living room looking at the wall beside the fireplace, now carefully repaired, and repainted the hidden cabinet's outline still faintly visible if you knew where to look. Dr. Morrison drove down from Nashville and walked through every room with the quiet pleasure of someone whose expertise had been part of something that mattered. Edward Harrison stood in the kitchen and said nothing for a while, and then spoke quietly. "Your father was right about you, the only thing Catherine needed to hear. Laura came with lasagna and wine and laughter. Margaret brought stories about the original Hayes family details she'd dug up from the County Historical Society. Townspeople who'd helped in small ways arrived with food and congratulations. The hardware store owner who'd extended credit. The librarian who'd found historical documents. The mechanic who'd fixed the pickup truck on faith. Rachel and Brian ran through the house and yard and barn with the freedom of children who understood without being told that something important had happened, that their lives had changed in a way that was permanent and real. Brian's room. The left side bedroom he'd claimed months ago was decorated with drawings he'd made of the farmhouse at various stages of renovation. Taped to the wall in rough chronological order, they showed the progression from broken to whole. Rachel had asked if she could keep the photograph of William Hayes that the Tennessee State Museum had provided as part of their research. A formal portrait from the 1880s showing a lean, careful-looking man with a woodworker's hands. It hung now in a small frame on the living room wall near where the hidden cabinet had been, because Rachel had said he should be able to see what happened to his house. Dusk was settling when the gravel driveway sounded with another car approaching. Catherine was on the back porch with Laura watching Rachel and Brian chase fireflies in the yard. She tensed. Laura stood. Christopher and Stephanie's car. They got out slowly, hesitant, in a way Catherine had never seen from either of them. Christopher held a bottle of wine. Stephanie held flowers. They stood at the porch edge in the failing light. Long silence. Then Stephanie spoke. "We don't expect you to forgive us. We don't deserve it. But we needed to see what you built." Catherine said nothing. Behind her, Laura's presence was solid and reassuring. Christopher's voice came out rough. "I was wrong. About everything. You didn't manipulate Dad. You loved him, and he knew exactly what he was doing when he left you this place. I spent my whole life trying to earn his respect and never got it. I was angry, jealous. It's not an excuse. It's just the truth." Stephanie's turn. "I was unhappy in my own life. Seeing you succeed where I was stagnating, I couldn't handle it. So I tried to take it from you instead of fixing my own problems. I filed for divorce last week. I'm starting over. And I realized I want to start over the way you did. With courage, with work, not by tearing someone else down." Catherine looked at them both. Years of resentment don't dissolve in a single apology. But she saw something she hadn't seen before. They were trying. And maybe trying was enough for tonight. "Come see the house." She walked them through. They saw the living room with its high ceilings and restored fireplace and morning light that would flood through the clear windows. The kitchen with its polished wood stove and functional counters and view of the garden. The upstairs bedrooms with their original wide plank floors. Brian's drawings. Rachel's photograph of William. Christopher stopped in front of William's portrait. Read the small plaque Catherine had made. "William Hayes, 1845 to 1891. Built this house with his hands. Left it for his family." "We are his family." Christopher's eyes watered. "Dad knew this, didn't he? That you were descended from William?" "I think he did. I think that's why he bought the house back. And why he left it to me." Stephanie touched the wall beside the fireplace where the cabinet had been hidden. "All that time we laughed at you for getting a condemned farmhouse, and this was here, waiting. Not just the artifacts, the house itself, the legacy, the chance to build something." Christopher spoke quietly. "You deserved this. You deserved all of it. I'm sorry I couldn't see that until now." They sat together on the porch steps as dark settled fully. Rachel and Brian joined, curious about these relatives they barely knew. Christopher asked Brian about his drawings. Stephanie asked Rachel about the carved horse she was holding. It was awkward and tentative, but it was something. Catherine didn't know if they'd stay in touch, didn't know if this healed anything, but for tonight, sitting on the porch of the house William Hayes had built, watching her children talk with their aunt and uncle, it was enough. Christopher and Stephanie left as fireflies thickened in the yard. Marcus thanked Catherine for letting them see it. Stephanie hugged her first time in years. "I'm proud of you." Their taillights disappeared down the gravel road. Laura stood beside Catherine. "That was brave, letting them in. I didn't do it for them. I did it for Rachel and Brian. They deserve to know their family, even the complicated parts." After everyone had gone and the children were asleep upstairs and Laura had driven home, Catherine stood on the back deck she'd built from reclaimed lumber. The warm April darkness wrapped around her, the fields invisible but present, the creek audible at the back edge of the property, the farmhouse solid beneath her feet. She thought about the morning of the will reading, Christopher laughing, Stephanie shaking her head, the key cold and heavy in her palm. 6 weeks in a car with 2 children and $200. The first night on the floor of a condemned building with broken windows, letting in the cold. The hammer in her hand and the wall that gave way, and the objects wrapped in brown cloth waiting on a shelf in the dark for 136 years, for exactly the right person to find them. Her phone buzzed. Message from Christopher. "I heard it's beautiful. I'm glad." Catherine read it once, set the phone face down on the railing. She would respond eventually. Maybe the apology was real enough to deserve acknowledgement, but not tonight. This story makes me wonder about the things our parents leave us that aren't measured in money. My father left me an old toolkit I thought was worthless until I opened it and found every tool had a story. What's the most meaningful thing someone left you? Not the most expensive, but the most meaningful. Share your story in the comments. I read every one, and I'd love to hear yours. Tonight belonged to the farmhouse and the fields and the creek and the 2 children asleep inside and the craftsman whose journal had told her the right person would come and the father who'd known with the quiet certainty of a man who understood his children completely exactly who that person would be. Robert Anderson had paid $9 for a condemned farmhouse and left it to the daughter everyone else had pitied. What he'd actually given her was everything, not the artifacts or the money or even the land. What he'd given her was the chance to discover what she was made of when everything else was stripped away, and all she had left was herself and a key that fit a lock nobody else had bothered to open. She had opened it. She had walked through. And what she'd built on the other side of that door, the home and the life and the proof of her own capacity, was worth more than any number Dr. Morrison had ever written in his notebook. Catherine Anderson looked out at the dark Tennessee fields and breathed the cold spring air and felt for the first time in longer than she could remember completely and entirely at peace. Not because she was rich, not because she'd won, but because she knew bone deep and certain that she was exactly where she belonged. 47 Willow Creek Road, the house William built, the house Robert saved, the house Catherine restored. Home.